think there is this negative perception about when you work with your husband or with a friend. And
Mm.
like the majority of people that I work with are people who are friends of mine. My chief of staff is my
Mhm.
best friend from high school. So it's like we, people always see the downside of that, but I think there's a tremendous upside because these are people who have been in your life that you trust. And I only see the upside of working with people. I know there can be a rocky, there can be sometimes there can be some sticky situations that's going to happen, but that would happen with somebody who didn't know you for a long time as well.
Exactly.
So, right. So this is my long-winded way of asking, what are some of the boundaries as you all are in the deep in the throes of this company of Sable Labs? What are some of the boundaries you all have had to set between your working relationship and your personal relationship?
I mean, I'm happy you asked that question because I think boundaries is the most important part of that whole conversation. If you can work with, a friend, a loved one, a family member, as long as you set those boundaries. So for us, it was very simple things like not bringing the work home to dinner, not sitting at the dinner table and be like, can you just look at this one email that we need you to respond to that, I mean, Idris is so busy. It would be a lot of that. Like, babe, I need you to just sign off on one thing and I had to learn to not bring that home because it just became disruptive and would cause one to sort of bleed into the other, and we had to treat them like very separate things. And I had to put my ego aside and be like, okay, I need a meeting with him. I'm going to go through his assistant and schedule it in, and because that's a work relationship when it's at that point, right? And when it's a date, I'm going to call him and ask him for that on my own because that's our love relationship. So I had to learn the ways of working for both because he is a busy person, and I expect the same in return for him to, if he wants a meetings, for him to go about the way that he would want me to go about it with him. So those types of boundaries we had to set up very quickly because it was definitely going to be a lot of like, and there's an ease to it, right? When you can get something done a lot quicker when you have access to that person a lot more. But we have to understand with anyone that just because you want to work at a certain hour doesn't mean that they want to work at a certain hour. And I'm definitely like a midnight on emails type person, whereas he's like a 4 a.m. person. And I'm like, no, like it was midnight. You missed the gun. Like, sorry. So creating those kind of boundaries, but also when we have a failure in work, to not take that as a failure in our relationship and to be able to separate those two things. And when we have a win at work, to be able to not take that as a win in our relationship, because then the relationship just becomes about work wins. And I didn't realize that until we, are sitting and cheersing about just work things, or that's taking up the majority of our conversation. I'm like, wait, we forgot about the wins that we should be building in our relationship outside of work. So like it goes both ways. I think boundaries for me was the most important thing.
So how do you handle it? How do you all handle business disagreements? Like you see something one way, he sees it another way. How do you resolve those issues?
A greater team. because because we will come to a mute point sometimes, and and it can be like that in any workplace. Like some people just don't see, so we will there has to be compromise, of course, and there has to be compassion for the other person's um, version or agreement or argument. But I also think you need, and it helps when you have a couple more people feeding in and be like, actually, maybe this is unbiased people being, maybe this is the right way to go. Maybe that's the right way to go. And then we can go, okay, I'll accept defeat. The greater team thinks that this is great for the company. Happy to do that. But when it is just me and him, sometimes it can get contentious, of course, and it's not easy at those points when you're working with someone that you love, because you just want to go, babe, just let me win this one. Like, you don't know what you're talking about. And you have to remember, oh, hold on. This is a professional work relationship. I wouldn't talk to someone at work like that. So that can be kind of hard.
Now, you both have been especially passionate about a number of humanitarian issues,
Mm.
especially when it comes to improving the lives of people in rural communities. You all work very closely with the United Nations International Fund for Agricultural Development. You've been to Sierra Leone and visited there, and you do just a lot of work around the globe. Why was it important to you to make this component of international social justice a part of your very powerful platform?
I didn't know that it was initially. I think I always had sort of a philanthropic kind of side to me because my mom was very philanthropic in that sense. She's always been someone who would stand up for someone else, and regardless of any situation, it could be very small, but it could also be very big. Like she would fight for the story around or the stigma around Africans to change as long as I could remember, and that was something that obviously bled into me, like we spoke about earlier. But I think just growing up in that kind of household, when I had the opportunity and privilege to be able to find myself on a trip with a UN agency that I feel is one of the world's best kept secrets, like EFAD is not spoken about enough because it's quite different from, organizations like WFP or UNICEF who work on an aid model, which is very important. There's a time and place for aid. When there's a crisis happening, when there's a famine happening, you need aid organizations to go in. But the way EFAD structures itself is that it gives people a chance to build a livelihood of their own by teaching them a basic skill, and that skill is agriculture. And when you can live off the land that you literally live on, that changes the whole narrative, and you become independent in that way. You're not waiting for aid, or you become or you get into a position where you feel you can build resilience towards a crisis, because the crises won't stop, particularly with the way the climate change is going and how quickly people in rural areas need to adapt. So I felt so privileged to be on this trip. We're in Sierra Leone, like you mentioned. We went with Global Citizen, who I don't know if you know, amazing organization that encourages young people to use their voice. And if they don't even have anything in their pockets, you could still sign up, write a letter, speak out, and you get rewarded for it by going to a concert or something. So this amazing organization on one hand that helps build youth advocacy, and then the UN just educating me on what rural people are going through. And I was like, wow, because I thought I was going into this kind of, UN typical sort of aid model. They don't even accept private donations. It is literally about changing the way governments spend when it comes to investment in rural areas, when it comes to, whatever budget they might have built that year, if they're carving it out for aid and not adaptation, what are the long-term solutions that we're looking at? Aid in one sense can be very short-sighted, and when you engage governments in this way, you build a more sustainable model that isn't dependent on private donations and things like that. So for us, it was like, wow, I had no idea this existed. And then that one trip spawned this whole mission of like, okay, I want to do everything I can to kind of help people understand what EFAD does, who they are, and and help speak with the rural people who don't have a voice. But we're so thankful for the programs that were on the ground when we got there. It's funny because Sierra Leone had gone through an Ebola pandemic, which no one really cared or supported, or in the same way that we kind of rallied around the global crisis that was the COVID pandemic, unfortunately. So places in West Africa were kind of left on their own. But organizations like EFAD built systems up that when the informal markets closed, for example, and women who make up the majority of rural communities had nowhere to go and sell the stuff that they had just grown, they had people who could come in and give loans and help them build more climate resilient seeds and find routes around closures, and and build structures and put structures in place that could help them get through it. And hearing that on the ground, I was like, wow, okay, EFAT stays the course. And I know this kind of sounds like and probably an advertisement for like the UN, but this is my genuine experience with this agency, and I just thought that has changed and shifted my whole way of thinking about how we should look at development funding and how we should engage governments around development funding for rural people, because we actually need them. They're the ones who grow a third of the world's food. They're the ones who help protect biodiversity in their regions. It's so much different from big agro. Small agro actually is part of the fight against climate change. I mean, if we stopped all greenhouse gas emissions today, okay, and we went completely green, you would still need nature-based solution. You would still need people to replant trees and to protect regions and biodiversity and mangroves and rebuild the structures that we've destroyed. So you can't have the goals that we have in Paris without including rural people. But like 1% of climate financing goes to adaptation to protect rural people. I mean, it's a joke. It's an actual
Mm.
joke. And no one is talking about it because it's rural people who don't have a voice. So it was like, great. This is something that I really want to get into. And I'm thankful that now we're UN Goodwill Ambassadors for that agency and get to talk about it on every podium and every conference. And I'll keep talking about it. And I think, what IFAD is doing is really great.
Well, you said, you hinted on something or said something that was really important. A while ago, I had Rashad Robinson, who's the founder of Color of Change, on the podcast, and he said something that stayed with me. And he said, charity cannot fix inequality and structural, or he said, charity cannot fix structural inequality. And he's
Mm,
right. And so you telling me that they don't even accept private donations is big, because the private donations help in the short term. They help, but they
mhm.
don't change structure. You have to change the DNA of a structure in order for it to be sustainable for generations of people. And even in the understanding of the social justice fight in America, I often remind people of that, is that that's great that this person can build a school here, or this person
Mm,
can develop this here based off private donations, but it's not going to last unless the government is changed, that it has to be broken and put back together and reshaped so that
absolutely.
every, yeah, so that the equality actually lasts. So it's amazing to hear that you're a part of an organization that understands that fundamentally. Yeah, I know you didn't get into this kind of work for recognition, but nevertheless, you both received the Time 100 Impact Award. It's a very big award, a very big deal. So how did you feel receiving that award?
I mean, I still can't believe I received anything from Time. Like, oh my
Yeah.
God. Like, I never would. The working in the field is so, you're in a moment, and it's really hard to take a bird's eye view of what's happening, because it always feels like it's in crisis mode, and still feels very much in that regard. There's so much work to be done. So to receive an award, you feel like I just started this journey, and it did kind of allow us to sit back and go, okay, we've made some big strides, and we're thankful for that. But I think really what it did for us is just give us that extra bit of motivation to tackle that next hurdle, or the hurdle after that, because it's just, I mean, we've opened a Pandora's box for ourselves with what we can do and what people can do when it comes to advocacy, and how important it is to be able to use any platform that you have. Because even if you can speak to one person, and I say this all the time, you have a platform to encourage change and to encourage thought and conversation. And that's really what we should all be doing, is questioning why things are the way they are, because it's a shame to me that people get so forgotten on this climate conversation. People, like literal people, who are fighting every day against weather changes that are happening now, because for us climate change feels like a future conversation, or we're going to hit that 1.5 degrees, like who knows however long from now, 10 years or whatever. But there are people who wake up every morning not knowing if it's going to rain, if they can grow a crop. They haven't had rain seasons. Like, it's literally happening now in the global south and in rural areas. So for us, it's just about having the motivation to remember that, okay, it's crisis, 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 but there are changes being made. And I do feel now a little bit more hopeful from the commitments that we've seen. I mean, I'm still having bilaterals with governments who don't know what EFAD is, and I'm like, excuse me? Like, how many times are we going to have this introductory conversation? Because if you are a climate ambassador for our country and you don't know what EFAD is, there's a problem there. And that's to show why climate financing and climate funding is so poorly distributed, and isn't distributed in a way that has a long-term kind of thinking. So for us, I'm happy to build and keep talking and keep lecturing government on, you guys need to do better, because government do need to do better. And it's not about necessarily committing more, it's about committing smarter.